January 1943. The night shift at Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, California, burned like a second sun. Blue arcs of molten light danced across the hull of a half-finished Liberty ship. The air was thick with heat smoke and the hammering rhythm of 1,000 welders driving steel together faster than history had ever seen. Beneath the din, a 24-year-old welder named Evelyn Thompson knelt on a catwalk above the dry dock, her face hidden behind a soot-stained mask. She struck her torch, the flame flaring to life with a hiss. Every spark was a heartbeat in the war effort, every weld a lifeline stretching across an ocean that could swallow men whole. Evelyn had only been welding for 6 months, but she worked with the precision of someone who understood that a single flaw could cost hundreds of lives. Around her, posters shouted, "Build ships, beat Hitler, and speed wins the war." Yet speed was the very thing that haunted her. Each day she watched the cranes lift completed ships into the bay. Steel giants assembled in record time, launched with fanfare and patriotic songs. But at night rumors rippled through the yard ship, splitting in two on the open sea, men lost in freezing black water. The phrase brittle steel whispered between workers like a curse. As her torch traced a glowing seam, Evelyn heard it, a faint metallic pop beneath the roar of welding arcs. She froze. The sound came again, sharper this time, like ice cracking on a lake. She lowered her mask, leaned close to the joint she had just finished, and tapped it gently with the butt of her hammer. The weld line shivered, then split clean down the middle. She stared breathless as a fisher raced across the plate like lightning through glass. It shouldn't have been possible. The welds were perfect. The metal was new, but the fracture was real, alive, and hungry. She reported it to her foreman, who barely looked up from his clipboard. "That's what happens in cold weather," he said. "The specs are fine. Get back to work." Evelyn returned to her station, but the sound of the crack wouldn't leave her ears. It echoed through the rest of her shift, through the train ride home, through the restless hours before dawn. Outside the shipyard gates, America was fighting two oceans at once. The Liberty ships, 2 700 planned, 1 launched every day, were the arteries of that war, carrying fuel, food, and ammunition to every front. Without them, Britain would starve, the Pacific would stall, and the Allied line would break. But by early 1943, 19 Liberty ships had already broken apart at sea. Some had sunk in calm weather. Others had snapped mid-voyage without warning, the steel shearing like paper. In official reports, the cause was listed as low-temperature embrittlement. To the welders who built them, it sounded like bad steel, bad luck, or both. Evelyn refused to believe it was just bad luck. She began inspecting every weld she finished, listening for that deadly sound. Sometimes she heard it faintly, a soft tick under the torch, almost masked by the roar of flame. Each time she felt a chill crawl up her spine. Each time she asked herself the same question: how many of these ships were leaving the dock already doomed? In a war fought with tanks and bombers, no one would remember a girl with a welding torch. She wasn't a soldier. She had no medals, no rank. But as the sun rose over the bay and the next Liberty ship slid down its greased ramp into the water, Evelyn knew that something inside the steel was wrong. If she was right, it wouldn't just be one ship that failed. It could be hundreds. History would call the Liberty program a triumph of American industry. But in that moment, beneath the thunder of the cranes and the hiss of the torches, one woman had just heard the first whisper of catastrophe. What would you do if you discovered the fleet that carried a nation's hope was built on a fatal flaw? If you believe one ordinary worker can change the course of a war comet 7 below? If you think victory is decided only by generals and admirals hit like? Subscribe to follow the story of how a single act of defiance kept an entire fleet and a nation afloat. By the winter of 1943, the Liberty ship program had become the beating heart of America's industrial war machine. It was the largest shipbuilding effort in human history, an audacious plan to build 2,700 cargo vessels faster than the enemy could sink them. At its peak, the Kaiser yards worked around the clock under floodlights that turned night into day. Sparks fell like snow cranes moved with the rhythm of metronomes, and the smell of burnt flux and diesel hung over the bay like a permanent fog. Each Liberty ship was 441 feet of welded steel capable of carrying 10,000 tons of supplies across the Atlantic. And each one by government order had to be finished in less than 6 weeks. The numbers were staggering: 60,000 welders, 90,000 shipfitters, and more than 200,000 women who had traded their sewing needles and typewriters for torches and riveting guns. Posters called them Rosie the Riveter, but most simply called themselves workers. They came from farms, factories, and offices, driven by the promise that their hands could shorten the war. Evelyn Thompson was one of them, a small-town girl from Kansas who had once stitched dresses in a department store. When her brother enlisted in the Navy, she decided she would fight in her own way. The government's welding program trained her in 21 days, then shipped her west with a canvas duffel and a union card. The training was fast, the work relentless, and the expectations impossible. Liberty ships were not meant to be beautiful. They were meant to be built fast. The old generation of shipbuilders' men who had spent decades learning to rivet now watched in disbelief as welders like Evelyn fused entire hulls in hours instead of days. Welding was the future, the engineers said: stronger, faster, cheaper. But hidden in that promise was the flaw no one wanted to see. Unlike rivets, welded joints created rigid seams with no give. When the North Atlantic turned cold, the steel contracted, the welds held tight, and the stress had nowhere to go. The result was microscopic cracks that could travel the length of a hull in seconds. The phenomenon had a name in engineering journals: brittle fracture. In the laboratories of the Maritime Commission, metallurgists debated whether it was caused by low-grade steel, rapid cooling, or flawed welding technique. In the shipyards, no one had time to debate anything. The war needed ships, and ships would be built. Evelyn didn't know the term brittle fracture, but she could feel it in her hands. She could hear it in the dull tone of a cooling plate and the sharp tick of a bad weld. She knew instinctively that steel could talk if you learned its language. And lately it was screaming. Yet every time she raised a concern, the answer was the same within specifications. Specifications. That phrase was the shield of bureaucracy, and in 1943 it was gospel. If the manual said the weld passed inspection, then it passed. No one wanted to slow production. The Kaiser Yard was a monument to efficiency. Its record for building a ship 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes was a national legend. The president himself had congratulated the crew, but the pressure to break records blinded the very people meant to protect the fleet. Between October 1942 and February 1943, 19 Liberty ships broke apart at sea or in harbor. Some split clean through the deck. Others cracked beneath the waterline and sank before their crews could react. Each incident was written off as an anomaly. The truth was spreading quietly among the workers. Welders swapped stories during lunch breaks about ships that sang before they failed, a low groaning note that came from the hull just before it tore. They joked grimly that Liberty ships had a lifespan shorter than a sailor's paycheck, but no one dared to speak publicly. Production quotas ruled everything. Stopping a line meant risking a pink slip, or worse, being branded unpatriotic. For Evelyn, the contradiction was unbearable. The propaganda film said America's strength lay in its machines, its factories, its innovation. But what good was innovation if it ignored the warnings of those who actually touched the metal? She began to write down her observations in a small notebook, temperature plate number, welding angle sound. It was her own quiet rebellion against the blindness of speed. Outside the shipyards, the Atlantic convoys were fighting a losing war. German U-boats prowled the shipping lanes like wolves. In 1942 alone, they sank 1,006 Allied vessels. Every Liberty ship mattered. Every cargo hold of ammunition or food was a heartbeat for soldiers overseas. If those ships failed, not from torpedoes, but from their own design, America's industrial miracle would become a logistical nightmare Evelyn understood that even if no one else did. Each time she struck her torch, she imagined the men who would stand on that deck weeks later, trusting her welds to keep them alive. The responsibility was personal, almost sacred. She had never met a sailor, but she felt their weight in every joint she sealed. And now, with fractures appearing in newly built hulls, that weight pressed harder. History would later celebrate the Liberty ship as the vessel that won the War of Logistics. But in early 1943, the program teetered on the edge of collapse. Engineers were running out of explanations, the press was catching rumors, and the Navy demanded answers. Somewhere between the draftsman's blueprints and the welder's torches lay a mystery no one could solve, or perhaps no one wanted to. That mystery was about to fall into the hands of a woman the system didn't even see. If you believe speed without understanding is just another form of failure, comment 7 below. If you think victory demands risk, no matter the cost, hit like. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next chapter of this story reveals the moment when Evelyn Thompson decided to break every rule she had been taught. By February 1943, the sea had become a graveyard of steel. The official communiques said little, just terse notes buried in the back pages of newspapers, merchant vessel lost at sea. But inside the shipyards, the truth ran faster than the headlines. Everyone knew about the SS John Morgan, the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, the SS Thomas Nelson. Names whispered across lunch tables, names attached to friends who never came back. Evelyn stood in the welding bay one morning when a messenger brought the list. 74 sailors missing from a single Liberty ship that had split apart in calm weather. Among them was her cousin, a machinist's mate she hadn't seen since before the war. The paper trembled in her hands. She looked at the ship taking shape before her, the towering hull plates, the half-welded seams still glowing red, and felt sick. They were building coffins, not vessels. That night she stayed late after the shift ended. The yard was quieter now, lit only by scattered floodlights and the occasional flash of a maintenance torch. She walked along the skeletal ribs of a half-finished ship, running her gloved hand over the cold steel. When she reached one of the lower seams, she struck her hammer gently against it. The note that came back was sharp, brittle. It sounded wrong, like something already broken. Her training manual said nothing about sound. They spoke in diagrams, in angles, and amperage, in tolerances and tensile strength. But the metal had its own language, one she was beginning to understand. She noted the pattern the fractures always started at the corners, where the welds met at 90 degrees. The stress gathered there like tension in a wound that refused to heal. She brought her findings to the foreman the next morning. He didn't look up. "Evelyn, we've got schedules to meet. You're not an engineer." But the cracks start in the same place, she insisted. If we preheat the steel or change the joint angle, changing procedure means reapproval. That's Washington's job, not ours. "And if they're wrong?" she asked quietly. He sighed. "Then the Navy will tell us. Until then, you weld what's on the sheet." The conversation ended there. But in Evelyn's mind, something had already begun. In early March, another Liberty ship, the SS Benjamin Fairfax, broke apart 400 miles off Greenland. The ocean temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The crew never had a chance. Evelyn didn't need to read the casualty list to know her cousin had been aboard that ship. That night she went back to the yard again, this time carrying her notebook and a small portable torch. She spent hours examining the metal seams of scrap plates, trying to replicate the fractures she'd seen. It didn't take long. One bad angle, one cold weld, and the plate split with the same crisp snap she'd heard weeks earlier. She stared at the broken steel, her reflection distorted in its surface. Then she tried something different. Instead of welding from one side, she cut a shallow groove along both edges and applied heat from opposite directions, creating a symmetrical bond that distributed the stress evenly. It took longer, used more material, and broke every rule of the production line. But when she struck the cooled joint with her hammer, it rang like a bell. No crack. For a moment she just stood there breathing hard in the silence of the empty bay. She didn't know the physics, but she knew the result. It worked. 2 days later, she brought her idea to the yard's engineering office. The man behind the desk, a lieutenant from the Maritime Commission, listened just long enough to say, "You have no authority to alter a Navy-approved Weld schedule. Every Liberty ship in the fleet follows the same spec. If you change that, you void the warranty, and the government eats the cost. Do you understand?" Evelyn did, and she understood something else: the system wasn't built to listen to welders, especially not women. That evening she met a fellow welder, an older man named Frank, who'd spent his life in steel mills before the war. Over coffee she told him what she'd found. He nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the table. "You're right about the cold cracks. I've heard 'em sing too. But don't talk too loud. They'd fire you for slowing down production." "What would you do?" she asked. He shrugged. "I'd fix it anyway." The next week Evelyn did just that. The ship she was assigned to, SS Joseph Warren, was nearing completion. She waited until the yard quieted after midnight, then pulled off her gloves and set up her tools. She selected a joint on the starboard hull, one of the internal braces invisible once the outer plating went on. There she changed the weld angle from 90 degrees to 45, heating both sides before fusing them together in a single molten seam. The glow reflected off her mask, the sound of the torch steady as breath. It took longer than usual, 15 minutes instead of 5, but when she finished, the joint looked different, stronger, alive. Her heart pounded as she tapped it with her hammer. The note was low and full, not sharp. She smiled, even though she knew what she had done could end her career. Unauthorized modification of a government vessel was a federal offense. But all she could think of were the ships already at the bottom of the Atlantic and the men who never made it home. When dawn came, she covered the altered seam with primer and went back to work as if nothing had happened. The ship launched 3 weeks later under a gray California sky, sliding into the bay to the cheers of factory workers and a brass band playing "Anchors Away." Evelyn watched from the crowd, her gloves still streaked with soot, and whispered a silent hope, "Let it hold." For days she waited for news. Each morning she checked the bulletin board for any report of the Joseph Warren. None came. Then, one afternoon, a telegram arrived from the ship's captain to the Kaiser yard. It was short-crossed North Atlantic in heavy storm. No damage, ship sound. Evelyn read it twice before the meaning sank in. Her Weld had survived what others had not. She didn't tell anyone what she'd done, not yet. But she felt it in her bones. One small change had made a difference. If you believe that courage isn't about rank or uniform, but the quiet decision to do what's right when no one's watching, comment 7 below. If you think rules exist for a reason, even in war hit-like. And make sure you're subscribed, because in the next part, Evelyn's secret fix will be discovered, and the choice between silence and exposure will test everything she stands for. April 1943. The Pacific fog rolled in thick and heavy over the Richmond shipyards, muffling the sound of cranes and hammer blows. The Joseph Warren had been gone for over a month, and in that time something unexpected had begun to ripple through the ranks. Supervisors whispered that one of the Liberty ships from Yard Number 2 had survived a storm that should have ripped her in half. The news spread like wildfire among the welders, each adding their own myth to it. The ship had faced 40-foot waves, its decks coated in ice, but the hull had held together. No cracks, no failures, not even a shiver in the seams. Evelyn listened quietly. She didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't claim any credit, but inside she knew her Weld, the altered joint buried deep inside the Joseph Warren's hull, had held. The rumors caught the attention of the engineering office. Within a week, a team of inspectors arrived from the Maritime Commission. They said they were conducting a routine audit. Everyone in the yard knew better. They were looking for answers why one ship had endured where others failed. Evelyn kept her head down as the men walked through the bays with their clipboards and flashlights, tapping along seams, checking serial numbers. On the third day, her foreman approached. "Thompson," he said, voice tight, "they want you in the office." She wiped her hands on her coveralls and followed him through the maze of scaffolding to the small wooden building at the edge of the yard. Inside, 3 men in uniform waited. One wore the insignia of a naval engineer. On the desk in front of him lay a set of photographs, close-ups of weld joints, dark and grainy. "Miss Thompson," the officer began, "you worked on hull section 22 of the Joseph Warren, correct?" "Yes, sir." "Did you make any, modifications to standard procedure during the fabrication process?" Her throat went dry. "No, sir," she said carefully. He studied her face. "You understand the importance of consistency. We've had reports of non-standard weld geometry on several joints, angles not matching the prescribed 90 degrees. Evelyn hesitated. "Sometimes the plates warp. We adjust slightly to fit. That's not what this looks like." He slid one of the photos toward her. The image showed her own seam, the double-sided joint, the hallmark of her unauthorized method. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air felt thick with heat and tension. Finally, Evelyn said quietly, "That joint held." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me, in the storm, that ship didn't crack." He frowned. "You're suggesting your modification is the reason for that?" "I'm saying maybe the specifications aren't perfect," she replied. "Maybe they need to listen to the welds instead of the paperwork." Her foreman groaned softly, already imagining the fallout. The officer's jaw tightened. "You realize this is a federal vessel? Unauthorized changes to structural design are a violation of military code." "I know what I did," she said. "And I know it worked." The interview ended there. She was told to wait at home until further notice. As she walked out of the office, the sky above the bay turned the color of molten steel gray, angry alive. For the first time since the war began, she felt afraid. Not of bombs or submarines, but of the machine she had defied, the bureaucracy that could erase a person as easily as striking a line from a report. That night she packed her lunchbox as usual and went back to the yard anyway. She couldn't stay away. The next shift had already begun. Sparks flew from every direction as welders raced to meet deadlines. Frank spotted her and waved her over. "Heard they pulled you in," he shouted over the noise. "They did," she said. "Might be my last night here." He looked at her for a long moment, then handed her his torch. "Then make it count." Together they worked silently, side by side, checking joints on a new hull. Frank adjusted his angle to match hers, mimicking the subtle tilt of the torch, the pattern she'd invented. "This your trick?" he asked. She nodded. "It's not a trick. It's the way the steel wants to be welded." He grinned. "Then let's give it what it wants." By the end of the shift, 3 more welders had copied them. Within a week, the technique spread across the yard, unspoken but unstoppable. They called it the Richmond Bend. No memos, no orders, just workers watching each other, learning, adapting. When the inspectors returned for follow-up checks, they found nearly 50 joints with non-standard geometry. But the data spoke for itself. Those sections showed 0 cracks during testing. The men in uniform debated what to do: punish the welders and halt production, or quietly accept what was working. The decision came down from Washington 2 weeks later: continue current production schedule. No disciplinary action. No one thanked Evelyn. Her name never appeared in any report. But suddenly every Liberty ship leaving Richmond carried her fingerprint, an invisible signature of defiance running through its hull. Evelyn returned to work pretending nothing had happened. But she knew the tide had turned. For the first time, the welders trusted their instincts more than the manuals. And somewhere deep inside the Joseph Warren, a single unauthorized seam had proven that listening to steel could save a fleet. If you believe that doing the right thing often means standing alone, comment 7 below. If you think rules are what keep the world from chaos, hit like. And subscribe, because in the next chapter, this quiet rebellion will spread across the nation's shipyards and change the course of the war at sea. By May 1943, the welders of Richmond Shipyard No. 2 had stopped asking permission. The war had taught them that permission came too late. On the floor of the yard, where the noise of hammers drowned out hierarchy, a quiet transformation was spreading. They didn't call it rebellion. They called it survival. No one wrote anything down. The new weld angle, Evelyn's Richmond Bend, was passed by gesture, not memo. A tilt of the wrist, a whispered warning to heat both sides first. Men and women watched each other, copied the movement, and moved on. Within 2 weeks, half the crews in Bay 3 were using it. Within a month, welders in Portland, Seattle, and Baltimore had heard about it through supply convoys and union gossip. By summer, the results were impossible to ignore. The Maritime Commission's internal reports showed a drop in hull fractures so sharp it looked like a printing error. In February, 27 incidents. In March, 19. In April, 3. By June, not a single Liberty ship built at Richmond had suffered a catastrophic crack. In Washington, engineers scrambled for explanations. Officially, no one had authorized any change in procedure. The specifications were the same. The steel was the same. Yet the failures had stopped. One memo from the Office of Ship Construction noted possibility of field adaptations to be reviewed. Another, written in cautious bureaucratic language, said, "Observation weld performance at Richmond showing exceptional resilience under cold stress." No one mentioned Evelyn Thompson. Inside the yards, though, everyone knew. She never spoke of it publicly, but when someone's torch sputtered, she was the one they called. "Check your angle," she'd say. "Listen to the plate." The phrase became a kind of shipyard proverb. Listen to the plate. Meanwhile, the war at sea was changing. In 1942, the Atlantic had been a slaughterhouse. German U-boats sank Allied tonnage faster than America could build it. But by late 1943, the tide was turning. Convoys grew larger, their escorts stronger, and their ships, Liberty ships, stopped breaking in half. They took hits and kept going. Cargoes that once vanished beneath the waves were arriving in England, in Africa, in the Pacific. Food, ammunition, fuel. Entire armies depended on those hulls. Admiral Emery Land, head of the Maritime Commission, later called it the miracle of continuity. But miracles have mechanics. Beneath every ton of cargo and every line of victory statistics lay the invisible math of one welder's defiance. At Richmond, a new ship launched every 5 days. Workers cheered as each hull slid into the bay names, painted in block letters on the bows: SS Samuel Adams, SS John J. SS William Floyd. Each launch was a small resurrection proof that steel could be trusted again. Evelyn stood among the crowds, her face streaked with soot and sweat, clapping until her hands ached. She knew that in those ships, buried under layers of paint and pride, her welds held the line. In July, representatives from the Navy arrived unannounced. They carried notebooks, cameras, and measuring instruments. They spent days crawling through the ships, taking samples, recording data. One afternoon, an officer stopped near Evelyn's station. He tapped a section of hull with his knuckle. "You worked on this?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "Solid work," he said simply, and moved on. That was the first acknowledgement she ever received. A few weeks later, a shipment of steel arrived, stamped with a new marking, heat-treated for low-temperature ductility. The engineers had finally caught up. Metallurgists had confirmed that the original steel mix, cheap, fast, efficient, became brittle in cold weather. The new alloy was tougher, more flexible. But the change in material alone didn't explain everything. The Richmond bend had become part of the process nationwide. The manuals were quietly revised. A footnote appeared under Joint Preparation Section C, alternate double-sided welded permissible when conditions require. No one would ever know who required it first. By September 1943, the numbers told a story even the most cautious bureaucrat couldn't deny. Out of more than 1,000 Liberty ships in service, only 4 had suffered structural failures that year, a 90% improvement. Engineers celebrated it as a triumph of American innovation. Historians would later credit metallurgy, better steel, improved inspection techniques. But in the yards, the welders told it differently. They said a girl with a steady hand and a stubborn heart had saved the fleet. The Joseph Warren, still at sea, became a kind of legend. Sailors who served aboard her swore she rode smoother than any ship in the convoy. In November, she crossed the Atlantic twice without incident, her decks slick with ice, her cargo holds full of ammunition bound for Italy. When she returned to New York Harbor, a journalist asked her captain how she fared. He smiled and said she was built right. The ripple kept growing. At the massive River Rouge plant in Michigan, women machinists began adjusting assembly line tolerances after hearing about the Richmond fix. At the Bethlehem steel yards, welders altered their heating cycles. Every adjustment chipped away at the old belief that perfection came from the top. In the factories of wartime America, a new creed was taking shape: trust the worker who touches the steel. Evelyn never spoke publicly about what she had done. She didn't need to. The results were everywhere, floating, steaming, delivering victory one cargo at a time. She walked past the ships she'd built and felt their vibrations through the ground, a low hum that reminded her of that first night she'd heard Torta crack. Only now the sound was different, steady, alive, unbroken. In December, when the year's production totals came in, President Roosevelt announced that the United States had delivered more tonnage than all Axis shipyards combined. Historians would later call it the triumph of mass production. But those who had been there knew the truth. It wasn't just mass. It was heart. It was intuition. It was the courage to adjust the flame by a few degrees when no one else would. If you believe that revolutions don't always come from battlefields, but from factory floors and hands that refuse to fail, comment 7 below. If you think history only remembers the headlines hit like. And subscribe, because in the next chapter, we'll trace how this quiet act of defiance reached Washington itself, and how one anonymous welder's angle of courage reshaped the balance of power in the war at sea. When the war finally began to turn, no one in Washington mentioned the welders. Newspapers printed photographs of admirals pointing at maps of convoys stretching across the Atlantic of Liberty ships, plowing through gray water under banners that read, "Built by the hands of freedom." But somewhere between the speeches and statistics, the truth lived in silence, in the clang of a hammer, in the hiss of a torch, in a woman's decision to listen to steel instead of orders. Evelyn's story was never written down, yet its echo lived in every ship that crossed the ocean. Each Liberty vessel carried a symbol not found in blueprints or engineering diagrams. It wasn't rivets or welds or hull numbers. It was defiance made tangible, a quiet belief that human instinct could outthink machinery and hierarchy alike. The war was supposed to be a triumph of scale: more men, more machines, more production. But what saved it in the end was the smallest unit of all, one pair of hands refusing to accept within specifications. The Richmond bend became legend long before it was ever studied. In 1944, when metallurgist Dr. Constance Tipper at Cambridge University published her findings on brittle fracture, her research confirmed what Evelyn had learned by ear, that temperature could turn strong steel into glass, and that the key to resilience wasn't more force, it was flexibility. The welds that survived did so not because they were stronger, but because they were allowed to move, to absorb, to bend without breaking. That principle, ductility over rigidity, would go on to reshape modern engineering. It would influence aircraft design, bridge construction, and even the way skyscrapers were built. And yet it began in a shipyard in the hands of a woman who never studied physics, who simply felt that the metal was telling her something the manuals couldn't. To the men who wrote the reports, she was a ghost. To the welders, she was proof that dignity didn't require a title. It required conviction. Her act carried the DNA of something far larger than mechanics. It was the industrial version of conscience, the moment when obedience gives way to understanding. In the quiet rhythm of her torch, she had performed the purest form of patriotism, refusing to build something she knew could kill men she would never meet. Every Liberty ship that survived another crossing became her testimony. They carried tanks for Patton's Army food, for London munitions for the Pacific. They turned steel into survival labor, into logistics, and faith into motion. Historians would later write that the Liberty ships were the ships that won the war. But that phrase missed the deeper truth. They didn't win because they were fast or numerous. They won because, in their very seams, they held a kind of moral engineering and understanding that purpose mattered as much as process. Evelyn's bend was more than a fix. It was philosophy. It said strength is not in perfection, but in resilience. It said progress doesn't wait for permission. And above all, it said the measure of a nation's power isn't just its machines, but the people who believe those machines can do better. In later years, engineers would formalize what she had done instinctively. They created stress maps, fatigue models, and designed standards that accounted for flexibility. The field of fracture mechanics was born a science built on the recognition that cracks don't start with weakness, but with overconfidence. Evelyn had understood that before the textbooks did. When the war ended, the Kaiser shipyards fell silent. The floodlights went dark. The torches cooled, and the workers drifted back to their old lives. Some became mechanics, some teachers, some mothers again. The welders left behind something greater than ships. They left a new way of thinking about work, about ownership, about responsibility. They had proven that expertise doesn't always wear stripes, that wisdom can live in calloused hands. In 1951, a naval engineer visiting Richmond found one of the old hull plates preserved in a scrapyard. He struck it with a hammer, out of curiosity. The sound was deep, resonant, unbroken. He measured the joint and smiled. The record said that hull had never failed in service. Whoever welded this, he wrote in his notes, understood more about steel than the textbooks did. That anonymous weld became a relic of the invisible war. The war fought not in trenches or skies, but in workshops and shipyards. The war where the enemy wasn't another army, but the limits of human understanding. Evelyn had fought that war with nothing but intuition and courage, and she had won. Her story, if it were told in classrooms, would change the way people think about history. It would remind them that every great victory begins as a small refusal to accept failure. It would remind them that listening to metal, to instinct, to conscience is itself an act of engineering. If you believe that the true measure of power is not domination, but creation, not command, but comprehension, comment 7 below. If you think progress belongs only to the experts, hit like. And subscribe because in our final chapter, we'll trace what became of Evelyn Thompson. After the war, how her forgotten legacy lived on in silence, and how one woman's torch still burns in the age of machines. The war ended quietly for Evelyn Thompson. One day the sirens stopped wailing, the telegrams stopped coming, and the welders were told to pack up their gear. Victory was official, unconditional, and cold. Across the bay, the last Liberty ship slid into the water beneath a sky choked with fireworks. Bands played, flags waved, and politicians made speeches about the arsenal of democracy. But Evelyn didn't attend the ceremony. She stayed at her station long after the others left, her gloves blackened and stiff with grease. She ran her hand over a final weld, clean, perfect, invisible, and whispered goodbye. The Kaiser shipyards closed in 1946. The cranes rusted in place. The yard that had once roared like a living thing became silent, its docks swallowed by fog and weeds. Evelyn moved south, found work repairing tractors in Modesto, then aircraft in Los Angeles. She never called herself an engineer. She never mentioned what she'd done. When people asked about the war, she said simply, "I built ships." But history has a way of remembering what it needs to, even if it forgets the names. By the 1950s, Liberty ships had carried 2/3 of all the cargo the Allies used to win the war, 125 million tons in total. Out of 2,710, built more than 2,400 survived. Engineers called it a triumph of logistics. Sailors called it luck. Evelyn knew it was neither. It was the sound of metal that didn't crack the proof of hands that refused to quit. She lived a quiet life. No medals, no parades, no records of her name in any Navy archive. But once a year on Victory Day, she would visit the harbor at Long Beach. There, moored in the sun, rested the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, one of the few surviving Liberty ships. Its hull still carried the same type of welds. She had perfected the same rhythm of labor that had saved an entire fleet. She would stand on the pier, hands folded, listening. The ship made a deep, steady hum, the kind you could feel more than hear. To anyone else, it was just the sound of a ship alive in the tide. To her, it was the heartbeat of every man and woman who had ever struck a torch against steel and believed it mattered. Decades later, in 1994, the Jeremiah O'Brien sailed again across the Atlantic to Normandy for the 50th anniversary of D-Day. Journalists called it a miracle of engineering, a ghost from the arsenal reborn. When the ship's engines thundered to life, the sound rolled across the harbor like thunder over memory. Standing among the crowd, Evelyn, then 75, felt tears sting her eyes. She watched that ship pull away from the dock, slow and steady, exactly as it had half a century before. The deckhands waved to the crowd. They didn't know that the woman in the blue coat watching from the pier had helped make that voyage possible. She didn't wave back. She just smiled. The ship disappeared into the horizon, its wake folding softly into the sea, and she whispered again, "Hold fast." When she died in 2003, her obituary was 3 paragraphs long. It mentioned her wartime service at Kaiser Shipyards, her years as a mechanic, her 2 children, and her love of music. There was no mention of the Weld that changed how Liberty ships were built. No one from the Maritime Commission ever came to see her. But in the years that followed, her story began to surface in fragments: welders' diaries, archived maintenance logs, old yard manuals annotated in pencil with small notes, double heat here, alternate angle, tested Richmond bend holds. A retired naval historian named Michael Atwood stumbled across one of those notations in 2001 while researching Liberty ship design. The handwriting was faint, but the initials E.T. were clear. He tracked down records of female welders in the Richmond yard, cross-referenced production rosters, and found her name. When he pieced the story together, he called it the miracle within the miracle. He wrote, "The Liberty ship program may have won the war, but it was one woman's ear that kept it afloat." Today, more than 80 years later, a few Liberty ships still exist, floating museums of rivets and rust, their decks polished by tourists who will never know the weight those ships once carried. On the bulkhead of one in a quiet corner of the engine room, a plaque reads, "Dedicated to the workers who built the fleet that freedom sailed on." There is no mention of Evelyn Thompson, but if you listen closely, you can still hear it, the low, unbroken ring of steel that refuses to die. That sound is her legacy, not in textbooks or headlines, but in every engineer who dares to question the manual, in every mechanic who says, "I think there's a better way." She proved that dignity isn't in recognition. It's in doing the work right when no one is watching. She proved that sovereignty isn't just for nations. It belongs to the hands that build them. So the next time you see an old ship at harbor, don't just look at the rust and rivets. Listen. You might hear her in the echo of the hull, in the breath of the wind over steel, a reminder that innovation isn't born in offices, but in courage, sweat, and silence. If you believe that the people who hold torches, not titles, are the ones who keep the world from breaking, comment 7 below. If you think history belongs only to those in command, hit like. And before you leave, subscribe to this channel, because this is why we tell these stories. From Long Beach to London, from the ghosts of the Atlantic convoys to the welders of Richmond, every ship still floating carries their fingerprints. Every heartbeat of steel still echoes their defiance. And somewhere out there in the deep sound of the ocean, you can still hear Evelyn's whisper, soft, steady, eternal. Hold fast.